On July 2, 1908, Thurgood Marshall was born to Norma and William Marshall in Baltimore, Maryland. Marshall was descended from a former slave who was taken from Congo to Maryland. Early on, he learned to debate from his father, who would consistently engage him in conversation about day-to-day happenings. This would be one of the first factors that would eventually lead Marshall into pursuing a career in law. Marshall cited another major moment in his life, when he told a story of how his father explained the meaning and the history of the N-word to him, and told him that not only was he allowed to fight anyone who called him that, but he was ordered to do so. This inspired Marshall to fight not just for himself, but for others. You do what you think is right, and let the law catch up. Thurgood Marshall graduated from Lincoln University in the year 1930. He would then apply to the University of Maryland Law School. However, due to the fact that it was a segregated school, he was denied entry. Marshall would end up attending Howard University Law School and meeting a man named Charles Hamilton Houston, a soon-to-be mentor and friend. Charles Hamilton Houston was known to encourage students to use law as a means of social transformation. Marshall would later go on to say that Charlie Houston insisted they be social engineers rather than lawyers in a 1992 interview with the American Bar Association Journal. In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. Marshall graduated in 1933 as the top of his class and immediately opened his own law practice in Baltimore. He would then start what would be his 25-year career with the NAACP. He was involved in Murray v. Pearson, a case where a black student from Amherst College was denied entry to the University of Maryland Law School due to its policy of segregation. Marshall won the case by arguing that the policy went against the separate but equal rule of Plessy v. Ferguson, since the state didn't provide an equal educational opportunity for black students. Marshall then formed the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1940 and went on to desegregate many other schools. He would win cases that slowly but surely went knocking down the legal doctrine of separate but equal that was set up by Plessy v. Ferguson. During the 1940s and 50s, he would win a record-breaking 29 of 32 cases, including Smith v. Allwright, Shelley v. Kramer, Sweat v. Painter, and McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents. All of this would lead to the historical Brown v. Board of Education case, which would establish segregation in public schools as unconstitutional. Marshall backed up his arguments using psychological and historical data to prove that segregation was harmful to black students' social progress, self-esteem, and mental health. Although, despite the ruling, the battle for civil rights was far from over. To protest injustice is the foundation of all our American democracy. Marshall led the Legal Defense Fund to become its own organization, which remains independent to this day. He continued on to be a major frontrunner in the civil rights movement. He would travel across the South and fight numerous cases against racial injustice. At one point, he was simultaneously overseeing 450 cases. One of those cases included challenging a whites-only primary election, and another which made it easier for black Americans to buy and rent houses. Marshall would continue on to be a trailblazer as he continued fighting for justice across the South. His efforts would soon be recognized by President Kennedy as he was nominated to the U.S. Court of Appeals in 1961. 4 years later, he would be named Solicitor General by President Johnson, and in 1967, he was nominated for the Supreme Court. Marshall commented, saying, "I have a lifetime appointment and I intend to serve it. I expect to die at 110, shot by a jealous husband." President Johnson said the nomination was the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place. Marshall was confirmed on August 30, 1967. Sometimes history takes things into its own hands. Marshall's first few years as Supreme Justice went by relatively well, since he was surrounded by a liberal majority led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Marshall was against capital punishment. He stressed the need to bring back equality and justice to those who were discriminated against, and he was dedicated to making the Constitution work. He had proposed a sliding scale interpretation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and although it was never adopted, Many of the civil rights cases in the 1970s would reflect his values. After a number of years, however, his co-workers and allies, including Chief Justice Warren, would go on to pass away or retire, leaving Marshall in an increasingly conservative panel as Republican presidents would fill up the empty spots to take control. When he retired in 1991, he was known as the Great Dissenter and one of the last liberal justices in a mostly conservative Supreme Court. Our whole constitutional heritage rebels at the thought of giving government the power to control men's minds. Thurgood Marshall passed away on January 24, 1993, at the age of 84 from heart failure. He was an icon for the civil rights movement who fought for what he believed in. Marshall was determined and hardworking in every sense of the word, and without him, many things would be very different today.